tried and tested. One night, Edward was resting alone in the sheds. He was one of the oldest engines on the line, and was also reliable, despite his age. As he was resting, James came into the shed, boasting as usual. "Really reliable is here," he smirked. "I pity you engines. You should try and be more up to date like me." Edward looked at him annoyed. "James, you should concentrate on being more careful than being reliable. You can reduce the risk of having an accident if you do." "Pah!" snorted James. "What do you know about anything?" "More than you think," said Edward firmly. "I could tell you something about an incident that happened many years ago, involving two engines that were like you." He lowered his voice. "But much, much worse." "What do they have to do with me?" asked James indignantly. But he was sternly hushed. Gordon and Henry had come into the sheds, and they knew much about the two engines from experience. "Whatever happened to those two?" asked Henry. Edward thought, and then began. Now, this story happened after Edward came out of the shed for the first time in a long time. He shared the shed with 5 other engines, 2 of them Henry and Gordon. Then there was Eagle. Eagle was an engine that resembled James, with red wheels and dome, and was respected by the other engines. Then there were the trial engines. These 2 engines were primarily mixed traffic, but were boastful, nasty, and spiteful. They were known to the others as Ruthless Rick and Nasty Nick. Every time they met other engines, they shouted out rude remarks to them. "You engines are pathetic," they would shout. "Leave your work to more stronger engines like us." Edward was one of the few engines who stood up to them. "Keep going on like that and you'll both have an accident," he told them one morning. "Pah!" snorted Nick. "How would you know? You're only a small engine, and small engines aren't useful engines," added Rick. "Come on, Nick, we haven't got time with this waste of steam." And they puffed off. Edward watched them disappear. "One of these days they'll learn the hard way," he sighed, and went to find his coaches. Meanwhile, Rick and Nick were preparing to take a fast goods to the other railway. Nick led, while Rick coupled behind. As soon as the 2 engines were ready, the guard blew his whistle, and with a tremendous jerk, the 2 engines snorted out of the station and onto the open line. "Pah! Nothing to it, really," they sneered at a passing engine, who just scowled at them. Edward was at the junction, waiting for his path to clear. He then saw 2 columns of smoke coming round the bend, and then Rick and Nick blasted past at full speed, with the trucks rattling like anything behind them. Edward was staggered by their dangerous speed. "They'll have an accident at that pace," he remarked. His driver and fireman agreed with him. The signal changed, and he continued his journey. Later that day, Edward was resting on the coaling siding, taking on more coal, when the yard manager came up and spoke to Edward's crew. They then took Edward to the siding where the breakdown train was. "What's going on?" he asked. "There's been an accident down the line. A fast goods has been derailed, nearly colliding with the down express. We've been sent to help clear the mess." Three guesses who could have caused that, Edward thought, and buffered up to the train. It didn't take him long to get there, but when he arrived at the scene, he was surprised by what he saw. He saw a brake van and a few trucks on the rails, behind the stopped express, while the rest of the goods train were piled in a smashed heap down a steep slope, with a very sorry Rick and Nick in the middle of it. All Edward could do was laugh as he started to clear the mess. They managed to clear away most of the trucks, and Eagle, who had come from the other direction, wasted no time in taking them away. When Rick and Nick were lifted back onto the tracks, Edward pulled them back to the shed. "I can only hope you've learned your lesson after all this," he said firmly. Rick and Nick said nothing. But their lesson had come too late. Later that day, the fact director spoke severely to them. It was those trucks, sir," they faltered. "They bumped us, and they—" "No tales," snapped the fact director. "It was your fault, and you know it. You nearly caused a serious accident which could have hurt people severely. You have always had a bad reputation on this railway, and now I'm going to put a stop to it, once and for all. But don't say another word! You shall be sent back where you'll receive your punishment." He turned and stormed away. "And that's exactly what they did," finished Edward darkly. "They were coupled to a goods train bound for the other railway, and they were never seen again." The engines were silent for a very long time. Shame, though, Edward thought to himself. They did learn their lesson in the end, the hard way. And soon the engines were all asleep. All, that is, apart from James. He had a lot to think about.